Incredible numbers there. Let's talk now to Stephen Lynch, a former advisor to Sajid Javid, when he stood against Boris Johnson in the Conservative leadership battle. Welcome here to the programme. You were just talking to me as you were watching that of where you were when that exit poll numbers came. Did this even surprise you?
It did. It's far surpassed my expectations, and I imagine all of the people involved with the Conservative general election campaign. I was literally jumping off the tube here at Westminster to come and speak at the studio, and when I saw that image about how many results the Tories had won, I didn't quite believe it, to be honest with you, but it was only from previous experience from the last few general elections that I knew that the exit poll is remarkably accurate, and so it's proved to be.
Now, Sajid Javid, who of course you advised, as I was saying there, he was saying today, no one now needs to worry about a no deal. It was only a short while ago that again and again in interviews, Conservative candidates up and down the country were saying we will still not take no deal off the table for that trade deal that has to be negotiated in 11 months. So is it on the table or off the table now?
Well, there's will now. Boris has more of a mandate now to go and to get this withdrawal agreement through the House of Commons and to sit down with the EU27 negotiators.
But that bit hasn't changed.
That bit hasn't changed. That was always going to happen.
It has changed in terms of Sajid Javid's assessment of it.
Well, the government has got more leverage now behind it. So when it sits down to negotiate things like agriculture, fisheries, market access for the city and financial services, it has a lot more power behind it with those extra seats in the House of Commons. So a no deal is possible at the end of that period, at the end of 2020, but there's will on both sides for that to be a free trade agreement.
And you think it's possible, do you? It's still in 11 months. I mean, the rules at the moment, of course, with the UK and the EU are pretty much aligned. But the trouble is, as you get closer to negotiating a trade deal with the US, it diverges, and that's the problem with the timescale that's been laid out of 11 months.
That's a point, and also the EU have a fearsome reputation for being ruthless negotiators. It took them 7 years to conclude their trade agreement with Canada, which is the most EU-like country that is outside the EU, if you like. But if you look at examples of America and Australia, they have concluded trade agreements within sort of 2 years. So it is possible if both sides, if it's in their interests enough to conclude a deal within a short time frame.
Would you accept that now having a majority of 80, if he was to perhaps just extend that transition period, he now has it within his grip because he has the numbers in terms of seeing off perhaps part of the wings of the party that say absolutely not?
It's an interesting point. Ironically, for critics of Boris Johnson, the fact that he does have this increased majority that you highlight, it actually increases the likelihood that we have a slightly softer Brexit, or at least the trade agreement that we reach with the EU.
You think that's really likely, that this has changed the dynamic of the sort of Brexit that might actually happen?
It's slightly increased the likelihood. I'm not saying it's a race and certainty, but now Boris has increased freedom of movement, if I can coin the phrase there. He has increased room for manoeuvre. He's no longer in hock to the DUP in particular. The ERG, while there'll be a new intake of MPs, pro-Brexit MPs in this recent election, you know, your Mark Francois and Steve Bakers and Bill Cashers will have probably slightly less influence on him as before. So he's got more freedom.
That's a very interesting assessment in terms of just the diversity now of the sorts of seats that the Tories represent. How do you move forward in terms of a unified approach with so many diverse seats? It was very interesting. Boris Johnson was talking about those Labour votes that he said he welcomed but accepted could only be lent potentially, and said perhaps there is a need for change in the party. What sort of changes do you think need to be made in the party?
Well, there are several changes that can be made in terms of the candidates who stand for the party.
He's not talking about the candidates, he's talking about approach, what they believe in, what the party believes in.
In terms of policy?
Yes.
Well, Boris set out a very clear offer to the country, and the manifesto has been criticised for being very short and not being probably as lengthy as Labour's. But you can see perhaps in the election result why Labour perhaps had too many policies. What the party has to do is simply to deliver what it's set out to do. I'm not going to reel off the figures that we've all become familiar with. But delivering in crime, education and in health is how they do that.
Just a thought on the type of campaign that the Conservatives ran, because of course it has been hugely successful, but are you proud of the type of campaign that was actually run when you look at those occasions where videos were doctored in terms of what the opposition was saying, when you looked at that dodgy fact-checking website, when you looked at Boris Johnson ducking forensic interviews? Were you proud of the way the campaign was actually run?
I think I was proud of the discipline that the people running the campaign showed with some of these issues. I think they were...
So winning at all costs?
No.
At any cost?
No, of course not. Of course, the truth is very, very important. And I would just say, personally, you can make this point probably of a lot of parties in this election. There has been an element of people getting away with not being fully truthful and not telling the truth. And personally, I regret that. But if we come back to the Conservative campaign, they ran a very disciplined campaign, focusing on key messages, and they refused to be sort of diverted from that in the cut and thrust of campaigning. And they successfully highlighted Labour's weak areas, which was leadership, their convoluted Brexit position, and their economic policies as well.
Stephen Lynch, we have to leave it there, but thanks very much for joining me here this evening.